Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I am the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine, and I am joined today by Benjamin Y. Fong. He is Honors Faculty Fellow and Associate Director of the Center for Work and Democracy at Arizona State University. He's also the author of the new book, Quick Fixes: Drugs in America, from Prohibition to the 21st Century Binge, available from Verso. Benjamin Fong, thank you for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
So let's start with perhaps the lay of the land of drugs in America today. We use an awful lot of them, of an awful lot of different kinds. So perhaps you could, and you open with a shocking statistic about, the percentage of the world's opioids that are consumed in this country. So in this country specifically, what are we hooked on and how much?
Yeah, we're in the midst of a world historic drug binge. Americans comprise 4% of the world's population. We consume about 80% of its opioids, including 99% of its hydrocodone, a bit more than 83% of its ADHD medications or its amphetamines and amphetamine-like drugs. We are a uniquely drugged populace. I think just from personal experience, I feel like more people are using psychoactive drugs than ever, any other time that I've been alive. And that is confirmed by the evidence. You look at the trends of drug consumption over time. In the 21st century, they're all going up. So I think the most familiar part of this is the opioid crisis and associated deaths of despair. But really, it's across the board. It's benzodiazepines, amphetamines, antidepressants, antipsychotics, marijuana, of course. Really, with the notable exception of cocaine, all drug use is at a historic high and rising. And so in the book, I wanted to make sense of why that was, while at the same time, we still have this zombified war on drugs going with the largest prison system in the world and 1/5 of that population for nonviolent drug offenses. So it's a huge paradox at the core of American society.
I noticed you used the word zombified there to describe the war on drugs. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's still going. I think that's the first thing to say. It's still going. I think that it's lost its ideological justification on both sides of the political spectrum. I think people see the war on drugs as increasingly pernicious, and they're increasingly open to decriminalization and legalization movements around marijuana and other drugs, and recognizing that the war on drugs was not only a failure in itself, it did not stem drug distribution or consumption in the way that it promised, but it also bore all these perverse outcomes as a result. So I think that it still goes on. The prison population is still ballooned and ballooning in some cases. But the backers of the war on drugs, I think there are fewer and fewer of those.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, it's disappeared a lot from the political rhetoric. I mean, I feel like even on the law and order right, they're all focused on, BLM protesters and anarchists and Antifa and drug use. I don't know if Trump talks about drugs, but if you go back to 1980s and 90s, I dug into when in 2020 when I was writing about Joe Biden, some of his old rhetoric around drug use, and it really does. When you start to watch the clips, it's like shocking.
No, absolutely. Biden, forgotten or at least minimized by Democrats today, but Biden was a staunch anti-drug warrior. He joined together with Strom Thurmond in creating crime legislation. He's always kind of been that way. I think a few years ago, there was some shock that a few White House staffers were let go because they had admitted to using marijuana. But that's kind of in line with Biden's entire career. He's never been on that side of the Democratic Party.
That's good, though, right? We're in a good place. We've made some progress if no one believes in the war on drugs anymore.
We're certainly in a better place. The kind of anti-drug hysteria that's really made possible legislation like the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act or the 1988 version, the other key pieces of legislation in the acute phase of the war on drugs, that's no longer there. And so I think the population's less susceptible to that kind of thing, though, things change very quickly. Given what's going on with methamphetamine in this country, I could foresee certain scare tactics around that particular drug being employed for political purposes. But on the whole, I think that everything's trending towards decriminalization and legalization. I think that there are generally two things to be concerned about there. The first is that it's not just backyard marijuana growers that are benefiting from the new trends. It's large corporations, and the leading edge of this right now is in psychedelics. There are a lot of big corporate investors in the new psychedelics market, including Peter Thiel, whose Compass Pathways is very aggressively pursuing synthetic psilocybin patents. It's being, heavily corporatized, this new legalization movement, and most likely it's going to involve a reinforcement of existing trends in psychiatry rather than a questioning of them. This could be a moment where rethinking psychopharmaceuticals, where we're rethinking drugs in general, how we use drugs recreationally as well. But it feels like the way in which this is going is just going to, like I said, reinforce existing trends. The other bit is that I think that the enthusiasm for drug legalization, there's just this big psychedelics conference in Denver in June. With all the enthusiasm, there's little discussion of why it is that Americans are so interested in drugs today. And I think that that sort of points to the unique stressors of American society.
Right.
It's really difficult to look at drug consumption today and all the trends going up and not see some reflection of the present crises that we're going through.
Well, yes, I wanted to get to that because, as leftists, we are obviously staunchly opposed to the war on drugs, but there's also, there's the kind of libertarian opposition to the war on drugs, which says, well, whatever people do under capitalism, that's on them. We don't judge, we don't think about it, we don't try and we don't try and change it. Once we've rolled back the state, if everyone's addicted to drugs, well, that's personal responsibility.
Just quickly, one thing. One of the foremost legalizers is Milton Friedman. He has long used this argument to say that if you just leave it all to the markets, all of these perverse things that go on the drug war will go away. So it's important for legalizers to keep that in mind.
Right. When I went back to my hometown for the first time in a while, I was walking down Main Street and I noticed a new store that looked an awful lot like an Apple store, but it was weird because I couldn't tell what they sold. And then it turned out it was, pot dispensary, right? It was really, really strange because like a lot of these places, and I'm told in California too, and although I haven't been to California and see this, but there's like this, it looked like an Apple store. It was really like well designed and it was so corporate. It was so obviously backed by a lot of money. And it was very strange, and it felt like, oh, well, first off, I'm really glad that this is better than my youth, right, to have the legal stuff. But then it also felt like, I'm a little bit in Aldous Huxley land. This is also a little bit dystopian.
Yeah, there's a dispensary, I think it's based in Southern California, called Dosis. And when you walk in, it looks exactly like an Apple store. They've copied Apple's aesthetics so much that I'm surprised they haven't been sued. You don't even know that it's marijuana that's being sold. They sell things like sleep or restoration, like things with words attached to them, but you're unsure what's exactly in any of these things. I think there's undoubtedly something good about the present moment in decriminalization in particular and legalization secondarily. I think we have to look at, though, what these things mean at the present historical moment. And, when there is a dearth of private investment in sort of needed goods, a lot of the trends today are in privatizing public services, right? And so you can sort of see the expanding legal drug market as almost like the expansion of like public-private hybrids, in that it's bringing into the realm of profit extraction things that were previously outside of it, or at least outside of it in legal means.
Mm-hmm. One of the reasons I like your book is I don't think there has been yet, or at least I haven't seen, a solid left analysis of drugs. Because as we've mentioned, we've been fighting so long just on the stop the war on drugs as the left platform on drugs, that now we need to start having some more complex thoughts about, well, what does it mean when you could go to parts of this country and where it seems like the only public spaces are churches and liquor stores, right? I mean, is that something we don't have an analysis of? Do we just go, well, drinking, drugs, if we're a stupefied society, again, we're Milton Friedman here, that's the market at work, we've done our job by rolling back the state? Or do we analyze these things a bit and go, well, why are particular trends occurring? And what you do in this book is you take a few different kinds of drugs and you show, and they range from coffee to alcohol to opiates to cocaine and psychoactive drugs and the different histories and the different meanings and who uses them and why they use them, and trying to understand the phenomena that we see before us.
I think we can do both things at once. We can continue criticizing the war on drugs, and there are a lot of key staples of liberal drug reformism that are perfectly good, revising rules around mandatory minimums, different sort of measures around policing, legalizing marijuana. I think that all of these things are majoritarian demands, things that like people really want, and they would do a lot to undo the war on drugs. But like you say, we're in a different moment where Elon Musk is touting his ketamine use, where Peter Thiel is the leader in psilocybin distribution. And in that moment, I think the left needs to reconsider, well, okay, the war on drugs was obviously bad, but what about this current moment that we're living through? How do we make sense of it? For my money, I think that obviously going back to some kind of more conservative or prohibitionist mindset is not the answer. But I do think that those trends can be criticized, and they can be criticized by relating them back to the contemporary state of American society. Mm-hmm. And again, the particular stressors and inequalities and, anxieties that we face on an everyday basis.
Yeah, so let's go into a little more detail about that. Perhaps we could go through what you have in your book as what you call your orienting claims. You make a series of kind of general statements that frame the stories of the various different drugs that you tell from chapter to chapter. So let's just begin at the beginning. Your first claim is work structures, quote, normal drug use into a dosing regimen. Let's unpack that.
Sure. I think historically, drug use has had a much wider array of uses than it has in contemporary American society. So drugs are useful for communal fellowship. This was, I think, the primary way in which alcohol was used in pre-industrial societies, just to cement social bonds. Drugs have had religious and spiritual purposes. They have helped expand human consciousness in various ways. There are a potentially infinite number of ways in which drugs can be used, but given the imperatives of capitalist society, they tend to be used for one of two reasons, either to get up for the day or to briefly relax in your few leisure hours so that you can be refreshed for the next day. And if you think about the ways in which drugs are categorized, uppers and downers, that's pretty much how Americans use them.
You get up for work and then down when you come back. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And even for the psychedelics, these are drugs that really defy classification. Psychonauts have always held that they get you to the outer reaches of human consciousness and understanding. And yet today, how are they being used? They're being microdosed by Silicon Valley tech executives in order to better sparkle at work. It's a very instrumentalized purpose for psychedelics. And I think that sort of speaks to how drugs are used in general in a capitalist society. They're used to conform to the demands of work.
It's funny. I sit here at my desk, and as I was reading your book, those who are listening to this interview won't be able to grasp the full point, but I sat there and I was like, well, is that true? And then I went with my giant can of sugar-free Red Bull here that I use
that
to
is a giant
get myself
can.
through the work day. I think this is the biggest they sell at the grocery store. This is 20 ounces.
I think that's sort of what I point to as the defining feature of drug use, given the imperatives of work. One misunderstanding there is that people want to say, oh, does that mean that we're especially susceptible to the charms of drugs, given the imperatives of capitalism? And I would say not necessarily. If you look at alcohol consumption in pre-industrialized societies, like in the 1820s in America, we drank roughly, 3 or 4 times the amount that we do per capita today. There's a book about the time and the sort of nascent temperance movements called The Alcoholic Republic it's just a kind of alcohol usage, both in terms of quantity and quality, that it's kind of hard to imagine just how pervasive it was.
Mm-hmm. I think I have to admit that I became a drug addict in order to work harder. I mean, if I don't have my caffeine, I get a horrible headache.
Yeah, there's a wide range of forms for caffeine and other stimulants. Amphetamines is a really quintessentially American drug, I think, because they're just really good at what they do. The initial uses for amphetamine when it was first put on the market in the 1930s, they were not sure what to use it for, but the three different categories were improved mental performance, weight loss, and PEP, or like mood adjustment. And if you just think about those three uses, in all ways, they're very great drugs to have on hand in the United States. They help us do the things that we need to do to get up for the day, despite the fact that they have very well-documented negative consequences. I think amphetamines are always going to be useful to Americans, provided we maintain the imperatives we have.
It's no coincidence, of course, that Silicon Valley and Wall Street are notoriously drugged places. And I think Sam Bankman-Fried was on piles of drugs, wasn't he?
I don't know the specifics there, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah.
They're certainly at the top. And there's another thing that the left needs to adjust to. At the top, in elite circles, drug use is rampant. No one apologizes for it. It's sort of a fact of life. And in fact, these executives think about drug use as sort of maximalizing their best potentials, right? So in that kind of situation, like you said before, the left needs to rethink its critique of drugs more generally.
Yeah. I was just looking this up, and indeed, FTX, collapsed crypto empire. The head of it tweeted, "Stimulants when you wake up, sleeping pills if you need them to sleep." And they were known for, popping the Adderall all day.
Yeah, there's just in that quote that you just read, there's something very akin to almost like military discipline to that statement, as ridiculous as it is. And with amphetamines in particular, we really started taking them because of the military. It was the military that first saw their utility on a mass scale. It was soldiers in World War II who got accustomed to taking quote unquote energy tablets on a regular basis. And when they returned, that's really when amphetamine use became normalized in America. And you could almost think about it as an extension of military discipline.
I want to go to your second framing claim here, where you say psychopharmacology is the science of treating atomization. What do you mean by that?
Since the late 19th century, Americans have taken drugs quite self-consciously to deal with social imperatives. And in the late 19th century, a discourse around what was called neurasthenia took off. This was popularized by George Miller Beard. William James simply called it Americanitis. And the way in which it was conceptualized was this is, all the things that happen because we live in this urbanized, industrialized society. People become anxious, they become nervous, they have different sort of constitutional difficulties. And so there are a variety of, spa retreats for wealthier neurasthenics out there. But the primary way in which people dealt with this was through the patent medicine industry. Late 19th century, there was an enormous patent medicine industry in the United States. These were proprietary nostrums containing things like alcohol, opium, cocaine, all medically pure stuff. There was a lot of honesty just about why people were using these things and, to deal with the stresses of modern life. It was worth it, right? There was a broad understanding of the advances of Western civilization or whatever as being well worth it, but something that nonetheless took some accommodation. And it's very similar through the post-war period. If you look at drug and cigarette advertising as well at the time, there was very much a reflection of society in the drugs. So, why do you need benzodiazepines, amphetamines, barbiturates, et cetera? Well, you need them because you're working hard, you're anxious as a result of having to conform to all of these demands, and you deserve something to take the edge off. Once again, there's some recognition that there are social imperatives at work in drug use. It's really only since the biological revolution in psychiatry that we've come to accept these justifications around drugs getting at certain neurotransmitters, serotonin, norepinephrine, et cetera, is somehow altering the chemicals of our brains in order to allow us to resume our normal activities. It's only when those justifications became popular that the social reference dropped out. And so I think if you ask someone who takes drugs, psychoactive drugs medically, they would say, well, it does this one thing to some neurotransmitter reuptake or something like that helps, me function normally. That's a historically novel situation where we're not actually thinking about the social stresses involved in mental health.
Why aren't you able to function normally in the first place, right? What are the causes of that? I'll quote you here. You say, against the present psychiatric consensus, the mental illnesses that drive both medication and self-medication with psychoactive substances are not simply disorders of the brain. They're also illnesses of society mercilessly preyed upon by large pharmaceutical companies. I take it that an implication of this is that if we lived in a more functional society that met human needs better, we might not necessarily see less drug use overall, because people might use drugs for pleasure or for, as you mentioned, religious and communal purposes, but we would certainly use drugs differently.
Yes, I think that's right. And one of the reasons I would say that this claim might be controversial or it might strike people in the wrong way is that mental illness is something that's felt very personally. It's felt bodily. And I think that a lot of people want to say that, well, if you say that it's some reflection of contemporary society, you are diminishing the biological factors involved, or you're somehow dismissing its reality. And especially in the realm of mental health, I think it's good to be nominalist in all matters, right? If someone says something is real, there's no reason to dismiss it there. The questions that are interesting to me is well, why is it real? In what sense is it real? How did it come to be real? In, the case of, to take one category, to take the case of ADHD, I don't doubt that ADHD is real. Though every once in a while in some big magazine, you'll get a psychiatrist come out and say that, oh, this is not a real category or something. It's something that's constructed by pharmaceutical companies. I think the interesting questions there, though, are not whether it's real or not, but how did people come to see ADHD as a category that made sense of their experience? How did amphetamine usage come to be primarily associated with ADHD? Because historically, neither of those things were true. So it's a difficult claim, I think, but biology, our physical processes are part of our social conditions. They're affected by our social conditions. And I don't think saying that mental health is determined by contemporary social conditions need totally marginalize the biological explanation.
Nor does it counsel dropping the drugs before you change society, right? You're not saying, for example, just because your atomization and isolation might be what's making your depression truly terrible and unbearable, doesn't mean that your antidepressants aren't working or should be dropped.
Absolutely. In both medically and recreationally, psychoactive drugs are terrific. And that's one common misconception around the book, at least. Some readers have told me that I take a kind of negative view of drug use more generally and that I might be in league with the prohibitionists in certain senses. But it's not that at all. Drugs are a kind of miracle for human beings. It's the contemporary ways in which drugs are used according to capitalist imperatives that is the focus of the book, really.
Mm-hmm. Let's go to your third claim here, which is something you've touched on already, which is drug producers are typical capitalist organizations.
Yeah, I mean, on both sides of that equation, so in both the licit drug market and the illicit drug market, I think that there's a common conception that drug producers and distributors are particularly insidious organizations or individuals. So big pharma obviously comes in for criticism in left circles a lot. And then on the illicit side, through shows like Narcos, Breaking Bad, The Wire, whatnot, you get this understanding of the drug trade as particularly seedy and insidious. But how I view them in the book is just as very typical capitalist organizations. So we can start with big pharma. Big pharma is often taken to be especially corrupt in some way, but in what does their corruption consist? Well, they lobby and they sometimes bribe politicians. They artificially stimulate demand through often ridiculous advertising. They suppress negative press. They maintain exclusive patents. This is all stuff that just any corporation would do. The key difference is that they're selling psychoactive drugs, which are heavily protected by the FDA. On the illicit side, and this is where you get, sort of wild flights of fancy into just how violent the drug trade is. Most drug cartels operate according to principles you could almost learn in business school. It's not very glamorous stuff. The Pablo Escobar, who I think is the person most associated with violence in the drug trade, he sort of rose to power by inventing this insurance scheme that would protect cocaine shipments out of Colombia. Like, it wasn't like very glamorous stuff. It's not like he shot his way to the top. That being said, there is a lot of violence in the drug trade. A lot of it kind of operates almost by market principles, not some inherent ruthlessness. And here I'm following anthropologist Philippe Bourgois, who says that the violence that you see on the street, you could almost see it as a kind of human capital development. It's very market oriented. It's not just coming from some desire to be violent for the sake of violence. That being said, just to close off that thought, I think there is a good reason why the drug trade is seen as particularly insidious, and that's because it's a kind of convenient scapegoat onto which we can project all of our anxieties about our society. It's not us that's involved in something that is unthinkably exploitative. It's something over there. It's those drug-addled corporations and these violent drug producers. They're the problem. So vilifying the drug trade, it's a really convenient way of thinking that we're not involved in this insidious thing.
That calls to mind a lot of the 80s rhetoric about how, the worst people are crack dealers because they are destroying the inner cities themselves, and our responsibility is to lock them up.
Yeah, one could take all of those kinds of statements, all of the absurd things said about drug cartels and drug dealers, and apply them to CEOs, and almost none of the meaning would be lost.
Well, right. Obviously, you wrote this great article about cigarettes for us that has been adapted for this book, and the cigarette companies just operate like they're just large legal versions of street level drug dealers.
I would say worse. certainly more detrimental to Americans' health. Of the various drugs that I cover in the book, and I try to be comprehensive in terms of psychoactive drugs, I don't talk about non-psychoactive drugs, even though they're kind of some of the most interesting drugs, like the arthritis medication market in the United States is very interesting. But I only cover psychoactive drugs. I try to be comprehensive there. And of all the different things that I talk about in the book, cigarettes are far and away the deadliest. They're far and away the most harmful. It's another thing that was surprising to me. Cigarette consumption in my lifetime has certainly dropped off a cliff. It's not normalized in the way that it used to be up until the 70s and 80s. But still, it continues apace, and the way in which tobacco companies have adapted to the moment, whether through e-cigarettes or just sort of dumping their reserves on foreign markets, it's pretty remarkable. So the cigarette tragedy continues today.
All right. Get to your fourth claim here, which is that the difference between licit and illicit drugs is a class distinction.
Yes. I think in the official mythology, people want to say that licit drugs are safe and illicit drugs are harmful in some way. I don't think I know anyone who actually believes that. But trying to figure out what these markers actually get to is a bit more difficult. What I want to say is that this is sort of getting ahead to the fifth claim as well, that when we talk about drugs and when we want to control drugs, we're typically thinking about other people and controlling other things. And so in this particular case, I want to say that licit drugs are considered licit when they are associated with some respectable class of people, and drugs are considered illicit or bad when they are associated with some disreputable people. There's lots of cases of this going back to the 19th century. Then morphine usage was quite common in the supposed doctor visiting classes, while at the same time, there was a lot of anger at and demonization of Chinese opium subcultures. opium and morphine are pretty much the same drug. Morphine is a derivative of opium, and yet completely different social connotations around this. And it's sort of similar, throughout history in the post-war period. Benzodiazepine usage was fully normalized while heroin was demonized. You could argue that the effects of those drugs are not so different. Maybe the example that's most ready to hand for modern observers is the difference between cocaine and crack.
Sure.
Cocaine, it's really remarkable just how normalized cocaine was in the 1970s. Pretty much everyone thought that cocaine was on the path to legalization.
Yeah, you've got those incredible ads that you reprint from like High Times magazine where they're just advertising cocaine paraphernalia pretty openly.
Yeah, I mean, there's even the kit that was sold to turn powdered cocaine into rock cocaine. That was the most remarkable find from there. The cocaine paraphernalia in general was all over the place, but to see something that was actually like touting rock cocaine as an acceptable practice, this was before the sort of crack scare, was pretty remarkable. But again, cocaine and crack, you have one drug that is taken by elite white professionals. There's that famous scene in Annie Hall where Woody Allen sneezes into the cocaine. He's surrounded by like nice professionals who are talking about their trip out to California. That was really the association of cocaine at the time. And then once you get crack, which people at the time didn't totally understand was a chemical cousin of cocaine, you get completely opposed social judgments of it, right? It became an absolute menace. It became something around which the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act and the 1988 version as well were both designed. So another case where you get absolutely opposed social judgments. And I think in all these cases, it really had to do with the people involved. If you look at the emergence of domestic and global drug prohibition at the beginning of the 20th century, who are the targets? It's the Chinese and opium subcultures. It's black stevedores and cocaine. It's Mexicans and marijuana. The targets are always pretty clear. And I want to say it continues to today. There are ways in which legal regimes lag behind cultural acceptances around different drugs. And so psychedelics are still technically Schedule I drugs, but they're increasingly respectable because
different people are using them. It's not just hippies.
Right, exactly.
Let's close out with this fifth claim of yours, which is that drug policy really isn't about drugs. And you begin with that just extraordinary admission from John Ehrlichman, Richard Nixon's aide, where he says the Nixon campaign had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or blacks, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Good God.
It's a remarkable admission. There's no two ways about it. But I think in a way it sort of crystallizes what we all know about drugs, which is that when people talk about drugs, or even when people use drugs, they're dealing with different things than the actual substances. When people use drugs, they're dealing with various stresses and anxieties in their lives. When people demonize drugs, they're wanting to demonize other aspects about the society. And so I think that it's always a mistake to linger too long on the substances themselves. The drugs themselves are really interesting. But I think what they say about contemporary social conditions and the kinds of things we're facing on an everyday basis, that's really where drug discourse becomes interesting.
Well, let me just conclude here by asking you, where do we as leftists start with thinking about a rational approach to drugs? I mean, again, we've established the baseline, which is that criminalization is obviously cruel, but how do you think we should think about drugs after doing all of the research and writing that went into this book?
There are two poles between which Americans have swung wildly when it comes to drugs. And one is moralistic drug prohibitionism. This is really what inaugurated the temperance movement and alcohol prohibition in America. It's also what inaugurated the global war on drugs beginning in the early 20th century. And it's also obviously evident in the acute phase of the war on drugs with Nixon. The other pole of that is a unreserved drug enthusiasm. And there are all sorts of sources in American society that are pushing drugs as the answer to all of our woes. There's all sorts of places in American society where drugs are held up as the answer to our different problems. And we've swung between these poles pretty wildly. And I don't think Americans need any more drug prohibitionism, nor do they need any more drug peddling. I think what they need is a freedom from the kinds of stresses and anxieties that lead to both drug peddling and drug prohibitionism. And in the conclusion, I say, to my mind, the two best policies that could address the many different facets of what people consider the drug problem in the abstract are a federal jobs guarantee and Medicare for all. One, because when you look at different drug pathologies, different drug abuses, where do you see it? It's usually in the rich and the poor on either side. That's because you're sort of missing the regularization of work. There's something insidious about that, but there's also something regularizing about a regular work rhythm, and especially where work is meaningful, as it could be with public jobs provisions. A lot of the imperatives to avoid the drudgery of work, I think, go away. And then on the other side, a lot of drug taking today, both medical and recreational, I want to say is a result of not having adequate healthcare structures in the United States.
Right.
And if we could improve the different structures of care in America, a lot of the imperatives to use drugs or to use drugs as a way to cover over other problems, I think those would go away. And so they're not intuitive responses to the drug war. They're not, or either to sort of like new drug legalization movements. But I think that they're at root in all of the different problems we conceptualize around drug usage.
Well, the book presents a sophisticated and I'd say unique analysis of drugs in contemporary America. The book is Quick Fixes: Drugs in America from Prohibition to the 21st Century Binge. Benjamin Y. Fong, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.